a teacher, a YouTube channel, a prediction made a year before everything happened. In 2024, as the world discussed elections, inflation, and artificial intelligence, a Chinese academic named Jiang Shuiqin recorded a relatively discreet video on his channel, Predictive History, and said, with disconcerting calm, three things. First, Donald Trump will win the American elections. Second, the United States will go to war against Iran. Third, the United States will lose this war, and that will change the global order forever. At the time, many people ignored it. After all, who was this teacher? What method was this so-called psychohistory, inspired by a science fiction book? It seemed like too much speculation. Conspiracy theory, perhaps. But then came March 2026. The United States officially entered the conflict in the Middle East. Israel and the USA attacked Iran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was assassinated. A 12-hour ceasefire was announced and has already been broken. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of all the world's oil passes, is under real threat. The price of a barrel soared. Managers like BlackRock have already limited asset withdrawals. And Japan calculates that if the strait closes, its oil reserves will be exhausted in less than 9 months. And the Chinese teacher? He said, "I stood by my 3 predictions. They all came true." This raises questions that we cannot ignore. How did an academic manage to predict what governments, intelligence agencies, and major media outlets were unable or unwilling to anticipate? Who really profits from this war? And is there a deeper power structure behind all this, one that has been in place for decades and is finally being challenged? In this video, we're going to do exactly what Jiang Shuiqin proposes. Use a thought experiment to understand what's really happening. Let's start with the Forum magazine report on the teacher's prediction, but we'll go far beyond it. We will explain what happened, delve into the historical context that made this conflict inevitable, analyze who the real actors are and what each one wants, and build the most likely scenarios for the coming years. Because one thing is certain, what is happening in the Middle East today is not an isolated event. It is the result of decades of strategy, of economic interest, of political vanity, and perhaps the beginning of a historic turn that will redraw the map of global power. Stay with us. Before understanding war, we need to understand prediction. Because she wasn't a kick. It was a structured, methodological analysis, and that says a lot about the nature of the conflict itself. The teacher and the method. Jiang Shuiqin runs the Predictive History channel, where he applies concepts from game theory, structural analysis, and the idea of psychohistory, inspired by writer Isaac Asimov to interpret historical trends and anticipate geopolitical developments. Psychohistory, for those unfamiliar, is a fictional concept created by Isaac Asimov in the Foundation series, a science capable of predicting the collective behavior of large populations over time, based on historical and psychological patterns. Shuiqin uses this as a methodological metaphor, not as magic, but as pattern analysis. And the prediction was objective. This semester, I'm making 3 big predictions. The first is that Trump will win in November. The second is that the United States will go to war against Iran. And the third big prediction is that the United States will lose this war, which will forever change the global order. All were confirmed, at least the first 2, with the third still ongoing. What happened in June 2025? The prediction was confirmed after the U.S. entered the conflict in the Middle East on June 21, 2025, with a 12-hour ceasefire announced on June 23. The attacks were coordinated between the United States and Israel. The target, Iranian military and nuclear facilities. The most dramatic immediate result, the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei during the bombings, an unprecedented event in the country's history since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, addressed the Persian nation amid the armed conflict that has spread across the Middle East. The Ayatollah's death during the month of Ramadan transformed the political conflict into something much deeper. For a large part of the Shiite population in Iran and elsewhere, this amounts to a declaration of holy war, a jihad, against the aggressors. Reactions and diplomatic language. Here is where the analysis needs to be careful. There is what was said, and what was behind what was said. Reported fact. The U.S. declared that the attacks were aimed at destroying Iran's nuclear program and ensuring the security of Israel and its allies in the region. Israel claimed to be acting in self-defense. Analytical interpretation. Jiang Shuiqin points out that the forces that push the U.S. into this confrontation are not just geopolitical, they are domestic. Three groups with strong power of influence would be behind this movement. The Israel lobby, with organizations such as AIPAC and Christian Zionist groups, Wall Street, interested in global control of finances, and Saudi Arabia, which sees Iran as a strategic enemy. Who supported? The Persian Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, maintained a calculated silence, which in diplomatic parlance amounts to tacit approval. The UK aligned itself with the US. NATO issued a generic solidarity note. Who criticized? China demanded an immediate halt to operations. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the priority must be to restore regional stability and prevent the conflict from turning into an even bigger war in the Middle East. Russia also condemned the attacks. Brazil and other countries in the global south called for immediate diplomatic negotiation. The logic of the sunk cost and the ghost of Vietnam. For Shuiqin, the biggest risk is that the United States will repeat the mistakes of conflicts like Vietnam, where, even knowing that the war was impossible to win, the U.S. continued to be involved due to the logic of sunk cost, that is, not abandoning a war because it had already invested a lot in it. This is not abstract theory. It is a documented historical pattern. And Shuiqin goes further. He compares the current moment to the defeat of Athens in Sicily in the 5th century BC, when the greatest power in the Greek world launched an ambitious military expedition, underestimated the enemy, and ended up destroyed. Not because of a lack of power, but because of an excess of arrogance. Reported fact. The conflict continues in March 2026, with an exchange of missile and drone attacks. Analytical interpretation. The evolution of the conflict would indicate a war of attrition dynamic, in which Iran would have strategic advantages, and the Iranians have been preparing for this conflict for 20 years. The asymmetry that no one expected. A concrete and revealing fact about the nature of this war. We are seeing missiles that cost millions of dollars being used to intercept drones that cost only tens of thousands. This is not sustainable in the long term. In other words, Iran is fighting a cheap war against an adversary that spends fortunes defending itself. Each interception costs the Americans dozens of times more than the Iranian shell shot down. Multiplied by hundreds of attacks, this creates exhaustion that goes beyond the military. It is economic, political, and psychological. The big question now revolves around the capabilities of U.S. military stocks, especially with regard to precision munitions, anti-missile interceptors, and air defense systems. And the worst possible scenario, the only way out for the U.S., if trapped in a military impasse, would be to resort to nuclear escalation, which could put the entire world at risk. This is where seemingly local news becomes a civilizing issue. And that's why we need to understand how we got here. To understand the war of 2025, we need to go back long before 2025. The bully system, how it was built. Let's take up Professor Shuiqin's analogy and expand it with real history. After World War II, in 1944, the Allies met at Bretton Woods in the United States and created the financial architecture of the modern world. The US dollar became the global reserve currency. all other currencies would be backed by the dollar, and the dollar by gold. The USA emerged from the war as the greatest industrial and military power on the planet. In 1971, Nixon broke the bond with gold. The dollar became pure fiat currency. But then came a brilliant agreement. In 1974, the USA negotiated with Saudi Arabia that oil would be sold exclusively in dollars. The petrodollar was born, the mechanism by which any country in the world that wanted to buy oil needed to first have dollars, which meant maintaining relations with the US and accepting its influence. This is the cafeteria tax of the analogy. It is not charged with direct violence in most cases, but it is there, structural, systemic. And the bully's friends are exactly the Persian Gulf countries, which collect petrodollars and recycle them in the American financial system. Iran is the newbie who refused to pay. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 was the moment when Iran said no. Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah, who was an ally of the USA, and declared that Iran would no longer participate in this system. The hostage-taking at the American embassy in Tehran was the most dramatic symbol of this rupture. Since then, Iran has been systematically punished. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, American support for Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, which cost approximately 1 million Iranian lives. Iran thus learned that it was alone, and that he needed to prepare to resist. The gang of intermediaries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Wall Street. It is not enough to look at the US and Iran as if they were the only players. There are actors who benefit structurally from the hostility between them. Israel has a direct interest in preventing Iran from developing nuclear capabilities and in maintaining regional military supremacy. Iran's nuclear program poses an existential threat to Tel Aviv, which has pressured Washington for tougher action for decades. Organizations like AIPAC have recognized influence in the American Congress. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a geopolitical and religious rival. The confrontation between Sunnism, Saudi, and Shiism, Iranian, is at the root of almost every conflict in the Middle East. Riyadh funds and supports Sunni groups across the region, while Tehran supports Shia groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and militias in Iraq. Wall Street has an interest in controlling global financial routes. Iran, along with Russia and China, represents the main threat to the continuity of the petrodollar system, the mechanism that guarantees the supremacy of the dollar and American financial markets. The climb that led to 2025. Between 2015 and 2018, the nuclear agreement, JCPOA, provided a window of de-escalation. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The international community took a breath. Then Trump, in 2018, unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from the agreement, without Iran having breached any clause, according to UN inspectors. The sanctions are back. The Iranian economy has collapsed. Internal pressure on the government increased. From the Iranian perspective, the message was clear: negotiation does not work. The only guarantee of sovereignty is to have sufficient deterrence, whether nuclear or conventional. Iran has accelerated its missile program, expanded its regional influence through proxies, and built a military doctrine based on asymmetric warfare and attrition. The Strait of Hormuz, the center of the world. The key point of this war is the Strait of Hormuz, a stretch just 33 kilometers wide that Professor Jiang points to as the center of the world. Around 20% of all world oil produced in the Persian Gulf passes through this strait. Of the countries dependent on this oil, 60% of what is used in India passes through this strait, 40% from China, and 75% from Japan. The Japanese Prime Minister was direct. If the strait closes, Japan's reserves will be exhausted in 8 or 9 months, leading the country to economic collapse. This means that any escalation in the Strait of Hormuz is not a bilateral issue between the US and Iran. It is a global crisis. American deindustrialization as a strategic vulnerability. Here comes a factor that is rarely discussed in major media outlets. In a scenario of prolonged war, the US would face immense logistical difficulties, trapped troops, fragile supply lines, and an industrial incapacity to sustain a prolonged conflict due to American deindustrialization. In the wars of the 20th century, the US won largely because it had the greatest industrial capacity in the world. Today, much of this industry has been moved to Asia, including China. The ability to produce missiles, ammunition, and spare parts on a war scale is not the same as it was decades ago. This is not speculation. It is what military analysts from the US Congress itself have documented in recent reports. The story rhymes. And she's rhyming with Vietnam. Geopolitics is not about good and evil. It's about interests. Let's analyze each actor honestly. United States. Declared strategic objective. Prevent Iranian nuclear development. Guarantee Israel's security. Stabilize the Middle East. Real strategic objective. Maintain the petrodollar system. Preserve American military supremacy as a guarantee of dollar hegemony. After failures like Afghanistan, a new show-up force would be needed to restore faith in American military strength. Possible gains. If the operation is quick and decisive, regime change in Iran, installation of a pro-Western government, Iran's return to the global system under American control. Strengthened petrodollar. Regional influence reaffirmed. Risks involved. The combination of private interests, media pressure, outdated military strategy, and political ego could lead the US into a major confrontation without a clear exit plan. A long war in Iran, a country of 85 million people with mountains, a history of resistance, and militias trained for decades, could become the Vietnam of the 21st century. Iran. Strategic objective. Survive as a sovereign state. Expel the US from the Middle East. Control the Strait of Hormuz as a lever of power. Iran's strategic objective would be to expel the United States from the Middle East and assume decisive control over the Strait of Hormuz, converting the Gulf countries into client states subordinate to Tehran and no longer to Washington. Possible gains. The Iranians will not lose this war. They will maintain their sovereignty. The country, although destroyed in part of its infrastructure, could rebuild itself with more national cohesion, greater military capacity, and firmer control over strategic routes. Risks involved. Massive destruction of infrastructure. Humanitarian crisis. Even more severe economic isolation. And in the worst-case scenario, an American nuclear escalation. The psychological factor. Khamenei's assassination during Ramadan turned what was a political conflict into a religious one. For millions of Shiites inside and outside Iran, this is no longer a war of states. It is a sacred obligation to resist. Israel. Strategic objective. Definitively eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat. Destroy the proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis. Consolidate regional military supremacy. According to Jiang, Israel would seek to drag as many actors as possible into the war, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region. Possible gains. In the short term, Israel would emerge as the main regional power. With Iran weakened and without its proxies, Tel Aviv would have unprecedented freedom of action. Risks involved. An all-out regional war could bring unpredictable actors into the conflict, including Pakistan, an Islamic country with nuclear weapons. And the destruction of Gaza plus the conflict with Iran are isolating Israel diplomatically in a historic way. Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries. Strategic objective: weaken Iran. Maintain the American protection system. Preserve the power of monarchies. Possible gains: A defeated Iran means an end to the Shiite threat to Sunni monarchies. More regional power for Riyadh. Risks involved. The Gulf Cooperation Council would emerge devastated from a prolonged conflict. Gulf Cooperation Council countries receive 80% of their food through the Strait of Hormuz. If the strait closes, the Gulf monarchies, no matter how rich they are in oil, will enter an immediate food crisis. China. Strategic objective: stay out of the conflict while watching the American weaken. Protect your energy routes. Expand diplomatic influence. From there, the professor formulated one of his most ambitious theses, that the American economy critically depends on the recycling of petrodollars in the United States market. According to him, if this circuit is broken, the financial bubble supported by investments in artificial intelligence and data centers could explode, dragging the American economy into a deep depression. Possible gains. China is the largest oil importer in the Gulf. An American weakening in the Middle East opens space for Beijing to expand its influence through the New Silk Road project. And if the petrodollar weakens, the yuan gains ground as an alternative reserve currency. Risks involved. A nuclear escalation or the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would directly affect the Chinese economy, which depends on 40% of its oil from this route. Based on everything we analyzed, we will construct the most likely scenario, not the most optimistic nor the most catastrophic, but the most analytically grounded. Premise: neither the U.S. achieves a quick victory nor is Iran destroyed. The conflict continues in the format of a war of attrition. This is the scenario that Shuichen considers most likely and the most dangerous for the United States. Phase 1, 2025 to 2026 controlled escalation. The bombings continue. Iran responds with cheap drones and medium-range missiles, depleting American stocks of interceptors. The ongoing tension in the Strait of Hormuz is a double-edged sword for both sides. For the United States, it is a threat to energy security and the economy, and for Iran it harms its relations with the Persian Gulf countries. The price of oil remains high, between $120 and $180 a barrel, causing global inflationary pressure. Brazil and other countries that export food to the Gulf lose markets. The European economy, still dependent on imported energy, enters recession. Phase 2, 2026 to 2027, the collapse of the Gulf monarchies. This is the most underestimated point by mainstream Western analysis. In Zhang's assessment, the prosperity of these economies depended on a historic arrangement in which Washington guaranteed military protection in exchange for the centrality of oil. When describing cities like Dubai, Zhang argued that the image of security, luxury, and stability had been deeply shaken by the war. Professor Zhang believes that Bahrain will be the first country to fall, due to the Shia Muslim majority that will likely act against the U.S., and that Dubai will simply go bankrupt due to people fleeing the conflict, as 90% of Dubai's population is foreign. If this occurs, the impact on the petrodollar system will be devastating. Without Gulf monarchies recycling petrodollars in American markets, the flow of capital supporting U.S. Treasury bonds and American financial markets will contract dramatically. Phase 3, 2027 to 2028, the nuclear question. Here is the crux of the matter. Zhang said he did not see a clear path to de-escalation, saying, "I don't think there is a way out of this war." If the U.S. realizes that it cannot win conventionally, the pressure for extreme options increases. This does not necessarily mean the use of nuclear weapons, but it means even more destructive attacks, possibly the use of depleted uranium weapons, massive destruction of civilian infrastructure. Pakistan is a critical variable. It is the only Muslim-majority country with a confirmed nuclear arsenal. The professor mentioned Pakistan as a critical variable, especially due to the possibility of being drawn into the conflict in the event of direct entry by Saudi Arabia. The global effects. The consequences for the international order are profound. On the economic level, the international system's dependence on Gulf oil has become a factor of extreme vulnerability. The war would have the potential to disrupt trade, industrial production, and the political stability of U.S. allies. On a geopolitical level, American weakening accelerates what analysts call multipolarity, a world where the U.S. is still powerful, but no longer hegemonic. China, India, Brazil, and other countries in the global south gain room for maneuver and autonomy that they did not have before. On the dollar front, if the petrodollar is destroyed, it would cause the American economy to collapse as well. That's the most extreme scenario, but it's no longer science fiction. That's what serious analysts are calculating. Let's go back to the thought experiment we started with. The bully controlled the cafeteria. Everyone paid the fee. Friends collected the money. And the system worked until a newbie refused to pay. Professor Shuichen's analogy is powerful not because it is simplistic, but because it captures something that technical analyses often hide. The problem is not just the novice. The problem is what the newcomer reveals about the system. When Iran refuses to participate in the petrodollar system, it is not an act of religious madness. It is an act of systemic resistance. When other countries start trading oil outside the dollar, as China, India, Russia, and other BRICS members are doing, the same thing is happening. The newbie is not alone. And that changes everything. What does this war teach us? First, that great wars rarely start by accident. They are the result of power structures that accumulate for decades until they reach a breaking point. Professor Shuichen didn't predict the future with a crystal ball. He read the historical pattern accurately. Second, that economic and financial interests structure foreign policy more than any official discourse. War is not about democracy. It's not about human rights. It's about who controls the flow of energy and money in the world. Third, that raw military power does not guarantee victory. The U.S. spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, and lost in Vietnam, tied in Korea, lost in Afghanistan. As the Prussian General Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And when politics is founded on hubris rather than strategy, war reveals this with brutality. Fourth, and perhaps most important, that world order is not permanent. There was a British imperial order, then an American-Soviet bipolar order, then the post-Cold War American unipolar order. Each of these orders seemed permanent until they weren't. We are possibly living in the transition to the next order. And transitions of order are the most dangerous moments in history, because the actors are still playing by the old rules, while the new ones have not yet been established. Professor Shuichen ended one of his analyses with a grim but honest observation. The U.S. could become so dependent on a nuclear solution that the entire world ends up at risk, not out of malice, but out of an inability to accept defeat. This brings us to the final question for you, who have followed this analysis thus far. Are we facing a temporary conflict that will be resolved through diplomacy, or are we witnessing, the beginning of the end of the world order as we know it? The answer you give to this question will depend not just on the news, but on how deeply you understand the story. That's why this channel exists, so that you're never caught off guard by what no one predicted, when in fact, as the Chinese professor showed, some people had already predicted it a long time ago. But no one wanted to listen. If this video made you see the world differently, share it with someone who needs to see this. And ring the bell, because the next analyses will be even deeper. Until next time.